Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, lived across 2 centuries, from the 1160s to 1253, and in many ways he serves as a measuring stick for theological attitudes in the Latin West during that period, notwithstanding his own particular viewpoints. Indeed, sometimes it is the creative ways in which Grosseteste engages with the received theological tradition that reveals the very shape of those common assumptions and attitudes of the medieval West. As his memorial plaque by his tomb in Lincoln Cathedral states, "In this place lies the body of Robert Grosseteste, who was born at Stradbroke in Suffolk, studied in the University of Paris, and in 1224 became Chancellor of Oxford University, where he befriended and taught the newly founded Order of Friars. In 1229 he became Archdeacon of Leicester and a canon of this cathedral, reigning as Bishop of Lincoln from the 17th of June 1235 until his death. He was a man of learning and an inspiration to scholars, a wise administrator while a true shepherd of his flock, ever concerned to lead them to Christ, in whose service he strove to temper justice with mercy, hating the sin while loving the sinner, not sparing the rod though cherishing the weak. He died on the 8th of October, 1253. Neil Timothy Lewis has written a dissertation on Time and Modality in the theology of Robert Grosseteste, a work which shed some light on the early medieval understandings of power and possibility in theology. I thought it would be instructive for us to look through some of Lewis's points in this video, to compare how divine power and possibility was understood in the medieval West versus the patristic understanding we have been examining so far. This is a work which also complements Irene Bonini's book on possibility and necessity in the time of Peter Abelard. If we recall from a previous video on the medieval power distinction, the scholastics typically made a distinction between God's absolute power and his ordained power. The former was thought to reside in the divine essence itself, and thus to be limitless, whereas his ordained power was understood to reside in creation and other divine providential acts, which concern what God actually does. As Lewis puts it, the recognition of a realm of divine possibility outstretching the notion of intra-world possibility, of what can become or is the case, is not new to Grosseteste. It is appealed to in other writers of the period and of the 12th century in the theological literature concerning God's power. We find, for example, such talk in Peter Lombard's Sentences, a work with which Grosseteste was acquainted, in his discussion of omnipotence and counterfactuals involving God. Simo Knutila has argued that in these early writers there are really 2 quite distinct modal theories that have little to do with one another, a modal theory operative in regard to the created realm, and a theory of divine possibilities applied at the divine level, but not at the level of the created realm. We can think of this in terms of divine power most especially with regards to the contingency of the act of creating the world. This is possibility of a different level to the kinds of possibilities proper to the created order itself. But in Grosseteste, the notion of alternative divine possibilities is pressed into service to underscore an account of modality applying to sentences and dicta concerning the created realm. Grosseteste recognizes that to admit a realm of divine possibilities will have repercussions on one's view of what sentences about creatures are possible, necessary, etc. So if Knutila is correct, Grosseteste will be original in this regard. Secondly, while writers like Lombard et alia invoke divine possibilities, they do not delve into the difficulties such a notion involves. In this respect too, Grosseteste is different. He realizes that an account of divine powers and, more generally, of eternal powers in which power and time are divorced will face great difficulties. Part 1. Eternal Truths. In particular, Lewis focuses on the issue of eternal truths as they appear in Grosseteste's works. This refers to the truth content of certain propositions which concern God's foreknowledge chiefly. Since God is never without his foreknowledge of events in the created realm, we seem to run into certain difficulties for the scholastics. Surely if dicta, the statements about God's knowledge, have powers from eternity, i.e. that they possess from eternity, they must exist from eternity, and if this is so we seem to be faced with an infinite plurality of eternal beings, contrary to the view that there is only one eternal being, God. This difficulty, we may add, though it lurks in Grosseteste's discussion, does not come to the fore. However, the notion of the eternal truths itself poses the same difficulty, and is explicitly dealt with by Grosseteste. The context for the problem that arises comes in a claim made that there is an infinity of eternal relations, e.g. of knowing and willing, of God to creatures, which underlies in some sense his power for opposites. This raises the spectre of a plurality of eternal beings, which Grosseteste and all other orthodox writers of the period reject. God alone is eternal. This plurality problem, however, may be raised not just at the level of relations, but also at the level of the so-called eternal truths themselves. In order to avoid a multiplication of eternal beings, as he sees it, Grosseteste seems to appeal to a notion of relations, which I suspect is rooted in Porphyry's commentary on the categories, a standard work introducing students of philosophy to logic in the medieval period. The Aristotelian framework as presented in the categories, in a sense, dichotomized existent realities into substances and accidents. In Porphyry's handling, however, the category of the relation takes on an ambiguous ontological status. For Porphyry distinguishes relations from accidents and substances, while still seeming to treat them as realities of some kind. For the medieval West, the status of relations remains understandably two-sided, and in Grosseteste's own writing, there is no hard and fast distinction between real and conceptual relations, as there is in later medieval philosophers. As Lewis writes in his dissertation, we may identify the following elements in this state of affairs. The extremes of the relation, Socrates and Plato, for example. Sometimes the extremes are also called the terms. In the case of the relation of Socrates' similarity to Plato, Socrates is what bears the relation, the terminus a quo, the term from which; Plato, what the relation is to, the terminus ad quem, the term towards which. The extremes are the things standing in the relation, and since relations are construed as peculiar kinds of accidents by Grosseteste, they have a subject in which they inhere, the terminus a quo, term from which, and as it were point to the terminus ad quem, term towards which. The relation itself of similarity that holds between Socrates and Plato. The relation is usually construed as a particularized accident. The relation of similarity holding between Socrates and Plato is a particularized accident inhering in one of the extremes, and is numerically different from that holding between Plato and Socrates, and from any other relation of similarity. In the later medieval tradition, relations are said to be founded on what is called the foundation, fundamentum. Strictly speaking, the foundation is, in all but special cases, not one of the extremes, but some feature of the terminus a quo. In the case of the relation of similarity we are considering, the foundation would be Socrates' whiteness. Although Grosseteste talks of a relation being founded, the technical notion of the foundation of a relation is not present in his writings, and the foundation simply seems to be the terminus a quo of the relation. Thus, Grosseteste wants to say that considered as in a subject, the relation just is God, or God's essence. Considered as a tertium quid, it is neither God, creature, nor something over and above them. The first strategy is somewhat akin to the reduction of the relation of knowing to a monadic property of the knower. In this case, the idea seems to be that the relation of knowing is the divine act of knowing, or to use the semantic assent, the term God's knowing refers to the divine act, which is standardly identified with God himself. In this sense, we may say that the relation is God. The problem of theological determinism. Eternal truths, or true statements in this case, pertaining to divine foreknowledge, understood in this sense, does little justice to the contingency of such events in the created realm. How do we thereby avoid theological determinism? If the divine essence is absolutely necessary, as no theist would deny, and these true statements are founded in the divine essence, the terminus a quo of the relation, then it would seem that the relation is one of necessity. Grosseteste attempts to resolve this problem by suggesting that the relations are variable, and thus that their termination in creation is not necessary. He writes that, If the divine substance itself should be considered absolutely in itself, he can without a doubt both will and know opposites. If, however, it should be considered not absolutely, but in the relation by which it wills or knows particular things, he cannot will or know its opposite. The opposites in question are what we would call counterfactual possibilities, which Grosseteste suggests that God knows in his essence, because he is omnipotent and omniscient. But considered not absolutely but in creation, he knows the actual state of affairs which will come to be. This would, on the face of it, seem to introduce a distinction in God between his absolute omniscience and his foreknowledge. And we will later see how Grosseteste tries to resist this conclusion because of his commitment to absolute divine simplicity. In the meantime, Lewis explains that Grosseteste's professed reason for thinking that terms like knows X, while referring to God's essence, are not appropriately used in considering God's substance in itself, is that these terms are variable in their application, or as he puts it at the material level, that these relations are variable, variabilis. Here Grosseteste does make a distinction between the variable and the mutable. Variables are not by definition temporal, but could represent what we might call counterfactual possibilities. Mutability, by contrast, entails a change over time, which cannot be permitted in our understanding of God. Lewis goes on, I want to suggest by this he means that terms like knows X and wills X fail to express the divine essence in the above sense, in that in different counterfactual situations they will and will not apply. Thus, in a possible world where God creates X, God knows X will be true, whereas in a world where he does not create X, it will be false. This difference of truth and falsity is not, as we shall see, due to any difference in God, but to the different existential status of the creature, and thus the failure of the terms to express God's essence may be traced back to their relational nature. These propositions, therefore, are contingent upon the creation itself. However, as intimated above, though the terms knows X and wills X do not admit of temporal variability, and hence changes in their applicability over time would not be Cambridge changes but real changes, they do admit of counterfactual variability, as we might call it, and differences in their application in different counterfactual situations would involve real differences in the known object in question, but not in God. We might call these variations in God's knowledge Cambridge variations, by analogy with the talk of Cambridge changes. It is a consequence of this doctrine that if God is to be able not to do or to be as he is, it is only insofar as he is considered relationally that this is so, and hence not when he is considered absolutely in the sense we have been considering. Considered in himself he is not really variable, unlike creatures. This is a conclusion Grosseteste seems to draw after the above passage. Wherefore the power for opposites in God finds its first diversity in the eternal divine relations to the creature. For from eternity there are innumerable eternal relations of him to creatures, and even if creatures had not been going to be, there would also have been innumerable eternal relations to their absences, and these eternal relations are not God. The following point approaches the heart of the matter. It does not, however, seem to have dawned on Grosseteste, and one suspects that this is a problem that will bedevil other accounts too, that this doctrine undercuts or at least severely weakens the explanatory power of his theory of the absolute modalities. For it would seem that God's capacity not to know what he knows, etc., must derive not from any capacity of himself to be otherwise, but from the capacity of creatures to exist or not in different possible worlds. Moreover, it will not help to bring this back to God's creative power, saying that he need not create what he does. For create is a relational notion whose difference of application to God over worlds, or from eternity, is also ex parte creaturae, not God. Lewis summarizes the problem. The absolute modality of sentences and dicta is, therefore, brought back to God's power. But this, in turn, given the above account, seems to rest on the radical contingency of creatures, which itself stands in need of explanation. One might try to reduce it to the contingency of statements about them, but within Grosseteste's scheme this would be patently circular. Alternatively, we might try to explain modality by applying to statements differently in terms. for example of semantical compatibility relations rather than divine powers. Or we might appeal to the very natures of creatures independently of God, along Abelard's lines. But in either of these cases the recourse to divine powers is otiose. We are pushed in the direction of an alternative account that would in some sense make modality independent of God's will or knowledge. This problem also bedevils a certain account of contingency given by Edward Feser on his blog. Feser is a Thomist, and in an attempt to explain the contingency of creation, he takes recourse to begging the question. It is simply in the nature of things which are caused to be contingent, he says. The issue here is not only that he has failed to justify this assertion, but that if taken to its logical conclusion, it leads to the eunomian premise that the Son is contingent because he is caused hypostatically by the Father. We have to look elsewhere than to the fact of being caused in order to give an account of contingency. Indeed, the proper definition of contingency is something that could have been otherwise, which no orthodox Christian admits with regards to the Trinity. As Lewis correctly observes, a theory of divine power is a theory of the power of a free agent and must give an account of the force of God could have done otherwise. And Grosseteste sees, albeit not very clearly, that this requires something analogous to the talk of temporal priority, by which could have done otherwise is analysed along Anselm's lines in the case of free agents in time. We have seen how the Cappadocians allowed for a sense of causal priority, which was non-temporal, in terms of the divine power and divine energy. Grosseteste, not having access to these sources, searches for a solution to this problem, and comes quite close to the Cappadocians in certain respects. Grosseteste's professed source for the notion of natural priority in the view that it fails to apply to the persons of the Trinity is Chrysostom. However, we now know that the references to Chrysostom are in fact references to John Scotus Erugena in his homilies on the prologue of John. In particular, Grosseteste seizes on Erugena's claim that the Father precedes the Word not by nature but by cause, and applies it more generally to the divine power and act, holding that the divine power is not naturally but causally prior to its act. We have already seen how these notions of priority are or are not involved in Grosseteste's analyses of statements of power, but the content of the notions remains obscure. That is, from Lewis's perspective, it's not clear what the definition of natural priority is, as opposed to causal priority. I think it is very salient to point out Erugena's debt to St. Maximus the Confessor, and it is more than likely that Erugena himself derived this distinction from the Eastern Fathers. It is this influence of the Church Fathers that gives Grosseteste a basis for his concept of causal priority in God. What Grosseteste does quite unequivocally maintain is a causal priority between the divine power and act, as well as between the Father and the Son. This idea that the divine power is causally prior to its act is also taken from Erugena in the passage stated, and Grosseteste has almost as little to say on the matter as does Erugena in his homilies. One point he does stress, however, is that this causal priority may hold between things existing at the same time, or together in eternity. He thus denies that causes must precede their effects. This denial, which is perfectly commonplace for the medievals, is illustrated by a number of examples found in many of Grosseteste's works. For example, the standard medieval view that light operates instantaneously in illuminating, and Augustine's example of a foot eternally embedded in dust, and hence eternally causing its footprint. In certain respects, Grosseteste's theology anticipates that of Scotus, who also devoted attention to the issue of God's non-manifest power. The power not to do at T what one does at T, Scotus, echoing Grosseteste to some extent, calls a non-manifest power. It may be distinguished from the manifest power one possesses at T not to do what one does simpliciter, a power based on the creature's mutability. As Lewis explains, what is doing the work in Scotus's argument is the assumption that the contingency of an event is a matter of the contingency of its cause in causing it, and the view that causes are simultaneous with their effects. If we recall the exchanges between St. Gregory of Nyssa and Eunomius, we will find that this was also an assumption shared by those two thinkers. For Eunomius, the fact of the energy of creating, for example, being simultaneous with its own effect or product, entailed that the energy itself had to be an existent, separate from the divine essence. St. Gregory, by contrast, maintained that the energy of creating was not separate from the divine essence, but contingent upon the divine will, introducing the intermediate concept of divine power to explain how God has capacities which are eternally actual, without necessarily manifesting all their possible effects. While Scotus does not follow the Cappadocian conception of divine power exactly, he does share the key premise. Grosseteste too seems to anticipate some of the consequences of this premise, as Lewis points out.